Hello again, my name is Michael Scharf, and again, while I'm a professor here at Limestone, I am likely not your professor for this class. So if you do have any questions about the content of this video, please contact your instructor or your professor that you have in your section. So in this video, we're really going to go into a lot more detail of teleological approaches to ethics. And the chapter highlights two different types of teleological approaches. The first one is an egoist perspective. And what egoism is that we are going to evaluate the rightness or wrongness of a decision based on the long-term impact to us. So we're going to evaluate any decision, the outcome of that decision is going to be right or wrong based on the long-term benefit to us. Now, it really does look at the long term because in many cases there could be a short-term benefit to us by doing something wrong, but in the long run, if we really think about it, it's not to our benefit in the long term. So for example, if I'm a manager and it might be in my short-term benefit, say maybe to lie to an employee, because it gets them out of my hair, it gets them out of my office, and I think I'm done with it. However, is it really in my long-term benefit to lie to an employee? Because word's gonna get out that I lied to an employee, and probably my turnover is gonna be higher, and word's gonna get out within the company that people maybe don't wanna come to my group, whatever the case may be, that really, yes, while lying might be in my short-term benefit to get somebody out of my office, it likely is not in my long-term benefit to do that. And that's really what egoism is about. Now, for each one of these, we have to know what the theory is, and really the egoism is if it is in my, what is right is in what's in my long-term benefit. We also have to know how to apply it, which I kind of just did with the management scenario, and the argument against it. So one of the arguments against it is, for those of you who have taken economics, you've probably heard of Adam Smith's invisible hand, that if everybody does what is in their own best interest, the good of society is served. And from an ethical perspective, this is probably true, and it was probably true when Adam Smith wrote this in 1776, that, you know, he lived in Scotland, and likely they were small towns, and if the blacksmith cheated somebody, likely the entire town would figure out that he cheated, and that person would tell everybody, and no one would go to that blacksmith anymore. Therefore, it is not in his long-term benefit from an ethical standpoint to cheat somebody, because he's going to go out of business if that's the case. Now, does that really work today in the 21st century? And that's really the question. And I would argue that maybe it no longer works, because you look at companies that have done the wrong thing, that whether it's sweatshops and slave labor in China, or I worked for the company with the largest fraud in American history, and yet we didn't lose customers. And same with a lot of these companies that are setting up sweatshops in China and things like that, that really they're not losing customers. So is it in their long-term benefit under egoism to do something that is morally wrong? And that's really the argument against egoism, is does it really work in today's environment? Because most of us will still do business, whether it's Nike or Apple or whoever it happens to be, or many of the cases that you will do in this class, you know, whether it's Bridgestone from chapter 1, Ford from this chapter, all these cases, I mean, these companies did things that were wrong, and yet they're still in business today. And many of us buy their products today. So it is a real question on whether the theory of egoism even works today. So that's really the argument against egoism. The second consequentialist or teleological theory that is highlighted in chapter 2 is called utilitarianism. Unfortunately, utilitarianism is probably the hardest one both to implement, and if you're asked to do it on a test, it's probably the hardest one to do on a test. Not that it's difficult, it's just that it's not memorization and you have to kind of sit back and think of things. So what utilitarianism is what is right is what is in everyone's long-term benefit. And when they say everyone, it's everyone affected by that decision. So whereas egoism is what is in my long-term best interest, utilitarianism is you actually have to think of everyone that's impacted by a decision. So right there, it's a lot harder to implement that than egoism, where I only have to worry about me and I'm the prime importance. Now that doesn't mean that I'm not important in utilitarianism, it's just that I'm one person and I count one person's worth of either help or harm. So basically what you have to do with utilitarianism is, on any ethical decision, is go through who's helped and how much, and who's harmed and how much. I will say one of the downfalls of the text is they seem to almost make it where it's about numbers, where you just have to add up the number of people that are helped, the number of people that are harmed, and then go with that. And unfortunately, it's a little bit more complex than that, because you have to look at how much those people are helped and how much those people are harmed. So for example, take an easy one. You know, if you've got 500,000 people that are helped, but they're helped $1, and you've got 10 people that are harmed, but they're killed, it might be that we decide that the harm to the 10 is much greater than the help to the 500,000. So, and this is why it's a little bit difficult to implement, because you have to actually look at both the numbers and make an assessment of how much people are helped or harmed. I will say one of the difficulties that many people and students have with utilitarianism is that they only include the benefits and the harms to the company. And this is not the entire picture. So I mentioned that I worked for a company that had the largest fraud in American history, and you can go ahead and Google that if you want. But using the utilitarian method on that, you know, should you commit fraud or not, I think a lot of people would look at the costs and benefits of that and take a look at things like, hey, our stock price is going up, so that's a good thing. Employees are getting bonuses, that's a good thing. And maybe there's a couple negatives there that, you know, there's a risk of getting caught and there's a risk of going to jail for committing fraud. But really, just looking at those items is really an egoist perspective. Because really what is good for me, or what's good for the company, is good for me. Taking a look, for example, at Limestone, what is good for Limestone, even if it doesn't directly impact the business department, is good for me. Another group that increases the number of students by a few hundred actually benefits me because Limestone is on stronger footing and things like that. So the same thing's true in the business world, that generally what is good for the corporation is what's good for me. The trouble with that is there's a lot of other people impacted by that decision and that fraud than the people in that company. And I think most people then only look at that, but that again is the egoist perspective. So really what you have to look at is everyone that is impacted by that decision. So if you look at this case of fraud, yes, our stock price went up. Yes, our employees got bonuses and raises. However, what happens when our stock price goes up? we look better in the marketplace because we're showing extraordinary earnings, well, that means our competitors look worse. And what happens to their stock? It goes down because, again, people would be investing in this company, company A, and not in company B. So their stock goes down. Their stockholders are upset. And what happens when stockholders are upset? Well, generally, they voice that opinion to the CEO, and the CEO has to come up with a plan. And generally, what that plan is we've got to reduce costs to match what this other company A is doing, even though company A, unbeknownst to them, is committing fraud. And what happened in this actual case was our competitors ended up laying off tens of thousands of employees. So from an egoist perspective, it might be that you want to do it, but from a utilitarian perspective, you have to take a look not only at our company, but you have to look at the impact of those decisions on everybody else. So yes, our stockholders gained, but the other company's stockholders lost. Not only that, yes, we got bonuses, but tens of thousands of other people lost their job. So really, from a utilitarian perspective, you have to take a look at everyone and then gauge how much they're helped and how much they're harmed. So in this case, my guess is me getting a bonus, for example, is a benefit, but it pales in comparison to the harm of getting laid off. And when you have tens of thousands of people, so from a utilitarian perspective, it probably committing fraud is not the right thing to do. But you have to go through this exercise of going through who is helped and who is harmed. And again, it has to be everybody, not just those in the company. So that's a basic of utilitarianism. One of the things, again, so hopefully you know what it is, you can apply it in a situation, and then you know the downside of it. And one of the downsides is that it's extremely hard to implement because knowing the impact of every decision is a difficult thing to do. And knowing all the people that are impacted is difficult. So this is, like I said, this is the hardest one to actually implement. And it's probably the hardest one if you're asked to do it on a test, is because it's not just memorization. You actually have to, if you're asked to apply it, you have to go through it and maybe take, 5 minutes and sit back and kind of brainstorm and think of all the people that are helped and harmed by a decision and how much they're helped and harmed, and then come up with a decision on what is the ethical thing to do. The other important note is on utilitarianism, it is possible that both outcomes are bad, and under utilitarianism, you would select the one that is least bad. So there are decisions that you have to make that both outcomes are poor. You would just, under utilitarian, pick the least poor one. So that's really a summary of teleological or consequentialist theories. And in the next video, we're going to go over in more detail the deontological approaches.